They were told the Americans would let them die, that wounded German prisoners were not worth saving, that enemy doctors would watch them bleed out on cold floors while laughing at their suffering. The propaganda had been clear, repeated in newspapers, on the radio, in whispered warnings from officers. Surrender to the Americans means torture, humiliation, and death. But when Hilde Braun collapsed on the steel bed of a transport truck somewhere in occupied France in May 1945, what happened next shattered everything she had been taught to believe. The American surgeon did not walk away. He did not laugh. He did not leave her to die like a wounded animal on the side of the road. Instead, he dropped to his knees on the dirty floor of that shaking truck and fought to save her life with nothing but a pocket knife, a sewing needle, a bottle of whiskey for sterilization, and hands that refused to let her die. She expected death. She got something far more confusing. She got mercy. If you find stories like this powerful, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the untold true stories of World War II that history almost forgot. These are the stories that never made it into the textbooks, the moments of humanity that shine through the darkness of the greatest conflict in human history. Now let us take you back to the final days of the war, to a journey that began in fear and ended in something no one could have predicted. This is the story of Hilde Braun and the enemy who saved her life. The spring of 1945 was not a season of hope for the women of the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Services. It was a season of collapse, of surrender, of a world falling apart. Across Germany, the Reich crumbled like a house built on sand. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to smoking rubble. Armies that had conquered Europe now surrendered by the thousands, filing into captivity with empty eyes and hollow cheeks. And the women who had served as radio operators, nurses, secretaries, searchlight crews, and 100 other support roles found themselves caught in a tide of chaos that swept away everything they had known. Hilde Braun was 23 years old when the war ended. She had dark hair cut short for practicality, brown eyes that had seen too much too young, and hands that still trembled from the months of operating communication equipment near the front lines. The constant stress of intercepting enemy transmissions, of knowing that every message might be a death sentence for German soldiers somewhere, had left its mark on her. She slept badly. She startled at loud noises. She found it hard to remember a time when fear was not her constant companion. She had joined the Helferinnen at 19, swept up in the fervor that had gripped her generation. Everyone was joining something in those days. The boys went to fight, shipped off to fronts that stretched from the Atlantic to the Urals. The girls went to serve in support roles that freed more men for combat. It was patriotic duty, they were told. It was service to the fatherland. Hilde had believed it all, the speeches about German destiny, about the enemies who surrounded them, about the glorious future that awaited once victory was achieved. She had typed reports about enemy movements without thinking about what those reports meant. She had celebrated victories without counting the cost. By the time the war ended, she believed in nothing at all except survival. The speeches rang hollow now. The promises had turned to ash. Germany was burning, and the glorious future had become a nightmare from which there was no waking. All that remained was the primal need to live through each day, to find food and shelter, to avoid the bombs and the advancing armies, to somehow reach the other side of the catastrophe. The surrender came suddenly for her unit. They had been retreating westward for weeks, moving from one temporary headquarters to another, always one step ahead of the advancing Allies. The roads were clogged with refugees, with wounded soldiers, with the debris of a collapsing army. Food was scarce. Sleep was snatched in cellars and barns. Every day brought news of another city fallen, another army group surrounded, another piece of the Reich swallowed by the enemy tide. They were passing through a small French village, its stone buildings scarred by fighting, its streets empty of civilians when the Americans appeared. One moment Hilda's unit was trudging along a dirt road, exhausted and hungry. The next they were surrounded by soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms with rifles raised and voices shouting commands in English. There was no fight left in any of them. The officers who might have ordered resistance were gone, fled or captured or dead. The enlisted women simply stopped, dropped their meager belongings, and raised their hands. The Americans moved quickly with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. They separated the women from the male soldiers who had been traveling with them, herding each group toward different collection points. Hilda watched as men she had worked alongside for months were marched away without a backward glance. There was no time for goodbyes, no opportunity to exchange addresses or promises to meet after the war. The chaos of surrender swallowed everything. The women were directed toward a line of transport trucks waiting on the muddy road. The vehicles were olive drab, marked with white stars, alien and intimidating. American soldiers stood by each one, their expressions unreadable, their rifles held casually but ready. Hilda climbed into the back of a truck along with 17 other women. The space was cramped, the wooden benches hard, the canvas cover flapping in the wind. The smell hit her first. Diesel fuel, sweat, and something else beneath it all, the metallic hint of blood from whoever had been transported before them. Someone had been wounded in this truck. Someone had bled on this floor. Hilda tried not to think about what had happened to them. The truck lurched forward, and the journey into captivity began. No one spoke at first. The women sat shoulder to shoulder, pressed together by necessity, their faces pale beneath the dirt and exhaustion. Some clutched small bags containing whatever possessions they had managed to keep. Others held nothing at all, having lost everything in the chaos of retreat. A girl from Hamburg named Elsa, who could not have been more than 18, began crying quietly, her shoulders shaking with each sob. An older woman named Margaret, perhaps 30, put an arm around her but said nothing. What words could possibly help in such a moment? Words felt useless. They had all heard the stories about what happened to German prisoners in American hands. The Nazi propaganda machine had made sure every citizen knew what to expect from the enemy. American soldiers were barbarous, they were told. They tortured prisoners for sport. They humiliated women in unspeakable ways. They lined up captives and shot them in ditches, then left the bodies for the crows. The warnings had been repeated so often in so many forms that they had become an unquestioned truth. Now that enemy had them, and the women could only sit in the darkness of the truck and wait to see which horrors would come true. The road was rough, pitted with shell craters and scattered with the debris of war, burned-out vehicles, abandoned equipment, the occasional body lying where it had fallen. Every bump sent the women bouncing against each other, against the hard metal walls of the truck bed. Some braced themselves with their hands, others simply gave up and let the motion throw them where it would. Hours passed. The light filtering through gaps in the canvas cover grew dim, then dark, then dim again as clouds moved across the sky. They were given nothing to eat, nothing to drink. Their throats grew parched, their stomachs cramped with hunger. Twice the convoy stopped, and the women tensed, expecting the worst. This was it, they thought. This was when the torture began, when the humiliation started, when the truth of their captivity was revealed. But each time the truck simply idled for a few minutes, the engines rumbling, and then moved on. The guards outside spoke in English, their words unintelligible to most of the prisoners, their tone casual and unhurried. It was maddening, that casualness. Did they not know they held enemy lives in their hands? Did they not understand the power they wielded? Or perhaps they simply did not care, these American soldiers, about the terrified women in the back of their trucks. Hilda pressed her back against the metal wall and tried to steady her breathing. The wall was cold through her thin uniform, a chill that seeped into her bones. She thought of her mother in Munich, probably worried sick, probably standing at the window watching for a letter that would never come. She thought of her younger brother Karl, last seen heading toward the Eastern Front 2 years ago, his face so young beneath the helmet that did not quite fit. She had not heard from him in 18 months. She did not know if he was alive or dead, captured or still fighting somewhere in the chaos of the collapsing front. She thought of the small apartment where she had grown up, with its view of the church spire and the sound of bells on Sunday mornings. She thought of her father, who had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1943, worn down by rationing and worry. She thought of the girl she had been before the war, a student with dreams of becoming a teacher, of filling classrooms with children eager to learn. All of it seemed impossibly far away now, like memories from someone else's life. Now there was only this truck, this darkness, this waiting for whatever came next. It was on the second day of travel that the trouble began. The convoy had stopped near a bombed-out farmhouse, its roof caved in, its walls blackened by fire. The guards finally distributed water and hard biscuits to the prisoners, passing canteens and packages through the back of the truck. The women fell on the food with desperate hands, chewing the stale crackers as if they were fresh bread, gulping the water so fast it ran down their chins. But Hilda barely touched hers. A strange feeling had been growing in her stomach since the morning, a dull ache that had slowly sharpened into something worse. She assumed at first it was hunger. They had eaten so little in recent weeks, scrounging for scraps wherever they could find them. Or perhaps it was fear, the constant tension of captivity coiling in her belly like a snake, or the constant jostling of the truck, the relentless bouncing that made her teeth rattle and her head pound. She told herself it would pass. She told herself to be strong, to endure, to wait it out like she had waited out so many other hardships. She had survived the bombing of her unit's headquarters. She had survived the chaos of retreat. She would survive this too. It did not pass. By midday, the pain had become a fire in her lower right abdomen. She pressed her hands against her belly, trying to will it away, trying to find some position that would ease the agony. But each bump in the road sent fresh waves of pain through her, so intense that she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The taste of blood filled her mouth where her teeth had broken the skin. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Her vision began to blur at the edges. The other women began to notice. Else, her eyes still red from crying, leaned close and whispered, "What is wrong? You are pale as a ghost." Hilda shook her head, unable to speak. The pain was stealing her breath now, coming in pulses that matched the beating of her heart. Each pulse was worse than the last, a crescendo of agony that threatened to overwhelm her. She felt like she was being stabbed from the inside, like some creature was trying to claw its way out of her body. Margaret, the older woman who had comforted Elsa earlier, pushed through the crowded truck to reach Hilda's side. She had been a nurse before the war, trained in one of Munich's finest hospitals before she was conscripted into administrative work for the Wehrmacht. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Hilda, taking in the gray pallor of her skin, the sweat beading on her forehead, the way her hands clutched at her abdomen. Then her eyes widened with recognition of something serious, something dangerous. "How long?" she asked quietly, her voice low enough that only Hilda could hear. "How long have you been hurting?" Hilda managed to gasp. "Since morning. It started as an ache. Now it is—" She could not finish the sentence. Another wave of pain hit her, and she doubled over, a moan escaping her clenched teeth. Margaret placed a hand on Hilda's forehead, checking for fever, then moved her hand to Hilda's abdomen, pressing gently at the spot where the pain seemed centered. Even that light touch made Hilda cry out, a sound that silenced every conversation in the truck. All the women turned to look, their whispered conversations falling silent. Something was very wrong. They could see it in Margaret's face, in the way she bit her lower lip, in the fear that flickered in her eyes before she could hide it. "We need to tell the guards," Margaret said firmly, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "This could be her appendix. If it bursts, she will die. She will die within hours, maybe less. There's nothing I can do without proper medical equipment." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Several women began talking at once, their voices high with fear. Some prayed, their lips moving in silent petition. Others simply stared, frozen by the horror of watching someone die in front of them. One of them, a tall girl with blonde braids named Ingrid, moved to the back of the truck and began pounding on the canvas flap that separated them from the outside world. "Help!" Ingrid shouted in broken English, the words she had learned from American movies before the war. "Help! Woman sick, very sick. Please help!" The truck rumbled on, the engine drowning out her voice. Either the guards could not hear or they did not care. The pounding continued, more women joining in, their fists beating against the metal frame of the truck until their hands ached and their voices grew hoarse. Still the truck moved on, bouncing over potholes, carrying them toward whatever destination awaited. Finally, miraculously, the truck slowed and stopped. Voices outside, American English sharp and questioning. The sound of boots on gravel, someone approaching. The canvas flap was pulled back, and a young soldier's face appeared, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern as he saw the women clustered around Hilda's slumped form. She had lost consciousness now, her body limp, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her skin had taken on a grayish tint that spoke of serious internal distress. "What the hell is going on in here?" the soldier demanded, his eyes wide. Margareta pushed forward, her English limited but her meaning clear. She had learned a few medical terms during her nursing training, words that crossed the barrier of language. "Woman very sick, stomach, appendix. She needs doctor now or she dies. Please, doctor, now." The soldier stared at her, then at Hilda, whose face had gone the color of old paper. He disappeared from view, and the women heard shouting, the sound of boots running on gravel, more voices joining the argument outside. Minutes passed like hours. Hilda drifted in and out of awareness, the pain so intense now that it seemed to exist outside her body, a separate creature consuming her from within. She heard fragments of conversation, German and English mixing together, none of it making sense. She felt hands lifting her, carrying her, but she could not tell where. The world had narrowed to a single point of agony, and everything else was shadows and echoes. She thought distantly that this was what dying felt like. This was the end she had been warned about, bleeding out in enemy hands. At least it would be over soon. Captain Thomas Morrison was not supposed to be there. He was a surgeon attached to a field hospital 20 miles east, a specialist in trauma surgery who had spent the past 2 years piecing together the shattered bodies of American soldiers. He was returning from an emergency consultation with another unit, traveling by jeep through the chaos of occupied France. His jeep had joined the convoy for safety, just one more vehicle in the long line of military traffic clogging the roads. When the soldier came running to tell him a prisoner was dying, his first instinct was to refuse. He was tired. God, he was so tired. He had slept perhaps 4 hours in the past 2 days. His hands, usually so steady, had a slight tremor that he could not quite control. His supplies were low, his medical bag nearly empty after treating casualties at the other unit. And operating on enemy prisoners was not his responsibility. There were protocols for such things, chains of command, proper facilities. The prisoner should be transported to a hospital, processed through the appropriate channels, treated according to regulations. But something in the soldier's voice stopped him. Something in the urgency of the plea, the raw fear in the young man's eyes. "She's dying, sir. Right now in the back of that truck. The other prisoners say it's her appendix. They say she's got maybe an hour, maybe less." Morrison thought of all the soldiers he had not been able to save, all the boys who had died on his operating table despite everything he could do. He thought of his daughter Margaret back home in Ohio, the same age as this German girl. He grabbed his medical bag and followed. What he found in the transport truck stopped him cold. A young woman lay on the metal floor, surrounded by other women who looked at him with expressions mixing fear and desperate hope. Her skin was ashen, a grayish pallor that spoke of severe internal distress. Her pulse, when he pressed his fingers to her wrist, was thready and rapid, the heart struggling to compensate for blood loss. He lifted her shirt and pressed on her abdomen, his trained hands immediately recognizing the telltale signs. Even in her semi-conscious state, she screamed at his touch, her back arching off the floor. The diagnosis was obvious to anyone with medical training. Acute appendicitis, probably already ruptured. The inflammation had progressed to the point of perforation, spilling infection into the abdominal cavity. Without immediate surgery, she would be dead within hours, probably less. Peritonitis would set in, her organs would begin to fail, and no power on earth would be able to save her. Morrison had seen it before, in soldiers who arrived too late, in casualties who had been trapped on battlefields without medical care. It was not a gentle death. "We need to get her to a hospital," he told the commanding officer, a lieutenant who had appeared at the back of the truck. The lieutenant was young, probably not more than 25, with the harried look of a man who had too many responsibilities and not enough resources. He shook his head apologetically. "Nearest hospital is 3 hours away at least, Doc. Roads are bad, convoy's slow. We can't stop that long. Command wants these prisoners processed by tomorrow." Morrison felt the familiar cold anger that came when bureaucracy threatened a life. He had fought this battle before, against officers who cared more about schedules than survival, against a military machine that sometimes forgot the human beings caught in its gears. "Then she dies," he said flatly, letting the words hang in the air. "Is that what you want? A dead prisoner on your transport? A woman who bled out because we couldn't spare 3 hours?" The lieutenant shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking between Morrison and the dying woman on the truck floor. "What do you want me to do, Doc? I can't conjure a hospital out of thin air. I've got orders. We've all got orders." Morrison looked at the truck, at the dirty floor stained with old blood, at the frightened women huddled against the walls. He thought of the Hippocratic oath he had taken so many years ago, the promise to do no harm, to preserve life regardless of whose life it was. He thought of his daughter Margaret, her smile when she laughed, her determination to become a teacher. This German girl was someone's daughter, too. "Clear the truck," he said, the words coming before he had fully decided to say them. "Get me clean water as much as you can find. Alcohol if you have it, whiskey, brandy, anything that can sterilize. Clean cloth, sheets, bandages, anything that's been boiled or at least looks clean, and someone who can hold a flashlight steady with hands that don't shake." The lieutenant stared at him, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "You can't be serious. You're going to operate here? In the back of a truck?" "She's bleeding out," Morrison said, the words sharp as the scalpels in his bag. "I can operate here or I can watch her die. Those are the only options. The conditions are terrible, the risk is enormous, and there's a good chance she'll die anyway. But if I don't try, she dies for certain. Choose." For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind flapped the canvas cover of the truck. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like summer thunder. Then the lieutenant started shouting orders, and the chaos of action began. The other prisoners were moved to different vehicles, their faces pale with shock as they climbed out. Margaret protested, wanting to stay and assist, but Morrison waved her away. He needed space, not well-meaning helpers who might contaminate the field. Soldiers brought canteens of water, their contents warm from sitting in the sun, but precious nonetheless. Bottles of whiskey appeared, requisitioned from personal stashes, offered up without complaint. Torn bedsheets were produced from somewhere, not sterile by any standard, but better than nothing. Morrison emptied his medical bag on the truck bed, taking inventory of what he had to work with. Scalpels, thank God, sharp and clean. Sutures, both silk and catgut, enough for the job. Clamps to control bleeding, forceps for grasping tissue, retractors to hold the incision open. A precious bottle of morphine, nearly empty but enough for one patient. Packets of sulfa powder, the miracle drug that could fight infection if applied properly. It was not enough. It was nowhere near enough for a proper surgery, but it was what he had. He knelt on the hard metal floor beside the girl, whose name he did not yet know. Someone had propped a flashlight at the right angle, its beam cutting through the dim interior, casting sharp shadows across the improvised operating theater. A young sergeant named Williams held a second light, his hand steady despite the fear in his eyes. Morrison administered the morphine first, watching the girl's face relax slightly as the drug took effect, her moans subsiding to soft whimpers. Then he poured whiskey over his hands, over the scalpel, over her abdomen. The smell filled the truck, sharp and medicinal, mixing with the scent of blood and fear. He said a silent prayer, the first he had offered in months, perhaps years. He was not a religious man, not anymore, not after everything he had seen in this war, but in that moment, kneeling on a dirty floor with a dying girl beneath his hands, he found himself reaching for something beyond his own skill. Please, he thought, please let me save her. Then he made the first incision and the work began. The surgery lasted 47 minutes. 47 minutes of cutting and clamping and sewing in a bouncing truck on a French road while the rest of the convoy waited, impatiently. The appendix had indeed ruptured, spilling pus and infected material into the abdominal cavity. Morrison worked quickly, methodically, his hands remembering their training even as his mind raced with all the things that could go wrong. He cleaned out the infection as best he could, scooping away the contaminated material, irrigating the cavity with water and whiskey. He removed the diseased appendix, clamping the stump and cauterizing it to prevent further leakage. He searched for any other damage, any other perforation that might have been missed. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto his hands, and he paused to have someone wipe his face. His knees ached from kneeling on the metal floor, the hard surface digging into bone. His back screamed in protest from the hunched position. He ignored all of it, focused entirely on the task, on the life beneath his hands. This girl, this enemy, this stranger. She was his patient now, and he did not let patients die if there was any way to save them. Finally, after what felt like hours but was less than one, he began to close. The stitches were remarkably neat given the circumstances, small and precise, each one placed with the care of a master craftsman. He dusted the wound with sulfa powder, praying it would be enough to fight off infection. He placed a clean bandage over the incision, securing it with strips of torn sheet. Then he sat back on his heels and exhaled, a long breath that seemed to empty him of everything. The girl's pulse was still weak, but it was there, steady and persistent, no longer racing toward failure. Her breathing had evened out, deep and regular. The color was already returning to her face, a faint pink replacing the deathly gray. He had not expected her to survive. The conditions were terrible, the risk of infection enormous, the surgery itself a gamble against impossible odds. But she was alive. Against all odds, against all logic, she was alive. Morrison allowed himself a small smile, the first in longer than he could remember. The convoy reached the processing camp 3 days later. Hilda traveled in a different truck now, one that had been cleared of other cargo to give her space to lie flat. Margaret stayed with her, changing her bandages with supplies Captain Morrison had provided, monitoring her temperature for signs of fever. The American guards checked on her regularly, their faces showing genuine concern for the enemy woman who had been operated on in such unusual circumstances. Word had spread through the convoy about the surgery, and Hilda had become something of a celebrity, the German girl saved by an American doctor on the floor of a truck. The infection that should have killed her never came. Perhaps it was the sulfa powder, that miraculous white dust that could stop bacteria in their tracks. Perhaps it was the whiskey that had sterilized the wound, killing germs that would otherwise have multiplied. Perhaps it was luck or fate or the prayers that Margaret whispered over her every night. Perhaps it was something else entirely, something none of them could name. Whatever the reason, Hilda's fever stayed low, her wound healed cleanly, and by the time they reached the camp, she could sit up without help. The camp was a sprawling complex of tents and hastily constructed barracks, surrounded by wire fencing that looked more symbolic than secure. Thousands of prisoners moved through its gates every day, Germans of every rank and service, being sorted and documented and sent onward to more permanent facilities. Men were separated from women, officers from enlisted, SS from regular Wehrmacht. The bureaucracy of captivity was vast and impersonal, reducing human beings to numbers on forms, to entries in ledgers. The women of the Wehrmacht auxiliaries were a small fraction of the whole, perhaps a few hundred among tens of thousands. They were kept separate from the male prisoners, housed in their own section of the camp, watched by female guards and supervised by American nurses. It was not the degradation they had expected. It was not the torture or humiliation the propaganda had promised. It was simply, bewilderingly, ordinary. Uncomfortable, yes. Boring, certainly. But not cruel. Hilda was taken to the camp infirmary, a large tent with rows of cots and the constant smell of antiseptic. American nurses moved between the beds, checking wounds, distributing medicine, speaking in English that sounded strange but not unkind. They called her honey and sweetheart, terms of endearment that confused her until she realized they meant nothing personal. It was simply how these American women spoke, with a casual warmth that cut through the barrier of language. She was given real food for the first time in weeks. Soup, thick with vegetables and meat. Bread, white and soft, nothing like the sawdust-filled loaves of wartime Germany. An orange, impossibly bright against the gray canvas of the tent, its juice sweet and sharp on her tongue. She ate slowly, her stomach still tender from the surgery, each swallow both painful and miraculous. This was enemy food. This was the bread of her captors, and it was better than anything she had eaten in years. On her second day in the infirmary, Captain Morrison came to check on her. She recognized him immediately, though she had been barely conscious during the surgery. She remembered his voice, calm and steady, cutting through the haze of pain. She remembered his hands, gentle but sure, doing whatever needed to be done. He was tall, with graying hair at his temples and eyes that were tired but warm. He examined her incision with professional care, nodded with satisfaction at what he found, and spoke to the nurses in rapid English that she could not follow. Then unexpectedly he turned to her and spoke in halting German. The words were awkward, clearly rehearsed, but comprehensible. "You are strong," he said. "You will live. The wound heals good." She stared at him. This enemy who had saved her life, this American who had knelt on a dirty floor to cut her open and put her back together. She did not know what to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. Everything seemed inadequate. She felt tears prick her eyes and looked away, ashamed of her emotion. Morrison seemed to understand. He patted her hand gently, a gesture of comfort that transcended language, and said something in English to the nurse before walking away. He came back every day for a week, checking her progress, adjusting her treatment, speaking to her in his broken German about nothing in particular. The weather, the food, how she was feeling. Small talk that felt enormous in its kindness. She began to look forward to his visits, to the brief moments when someone saw her as a person rather than a prisoner. As the days passed and Hilda's strength returned, she was moved from the infirmary to the regular barracks with the other women. The routine of camp life established itself quickly. Morning roll call at 6, breakfast in the mess tent at 7, work assignments at 8. The prisoners were put to useful labor, nothing strenuous, nothing dangerous, just the ordinary tasks of maintaining a large facility. Some worked in kitchens, others cleaned barracks, some did laundry. Hilda, still recovering from surgery, was assigned light duty in the supply office, sorting forms and filing paperwork. The prisoners were paid small wages for their work, camp script that could be exchanged at a canteen for small luxuries. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, soap, writing paper. It was surreal. They were captives, enemies, defeated soldiers of a regime that had tried to conquer the world. And yet they were treated with a kind of structured fairness that defied everything they had been told to expect. There were rules, yes, and punishments for breaking them. But the rules were clear, the punishments proportional, the whole system governed by something recognizable as justice. The food alone was enough to shake their beliefs. After years of rationing, of watery soup and bread that tasted of sawdust and desperation, the American meals seemed almost obscene in their abundance. Meat at every dinner, vegetables cooked with butter, real coffee, dark and rich, instead of the ersatz brews of wartime Germany. Some women wept at their first full meal, tears streaming down their faces as they chewed food they had forgotten existed. Others could not eat at all, their stomachs rebelling against the richness after so long without. Letters from home began to arrive, filtered through military censors, but delivered nonetheless. The news was universally grim, cities destroyed beyond recognition, families scattered across the occupation zones, brothers and fathers missing or dead on distant fronts. One woman received word that her entire family, parents, siblings, grandmother, had died when their apartment building was hit by a bomb in the final weeks of the war. She read the letter silently, her face blank, then walked to her bunk and lay down without a word. No one knew what to say. What comfort could be offered in such circumstances? They were prisoners in a land of plenty while their homeland starved and burned and buried its dead. It was Margaret who first said aloud what many were thinking. They were sitting outside the barracks one evening, watching the sun set over the American camp, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly beautiful given the circumstances. The guards patrolled the perimeter with their easy, unhurried walks, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, more like watchmen than warriors. "They do not hate us," Margaret said quietly, almost to herself. "I thought they would hate us. I thought they would want revenge for all the things we did, all the things our country did. But they just treat us like people who need to be managed, like a problem to be solved, not enemies to be punished." The other women stirred uncomfortably. Such talk felt dangerous, even now, even in captivity. The habits of the Reich died hard, the fear of being reported for disloyalty, the automatic caution about saying anything that might be construed as criticism. But the truth of Margaret's words was undeniable. Day after day, the expected cruelty failed to materialize. Day after day, the Americans remained stubbornly, inexplicably decent. Hilda touched the scar on her abdomen, still tender, still healing beneath its bandage. She thought of Captain Morrison kneeling on the dirty floor of that truck, his hands covered in her blood, fighting to save a life that by all the logic of war meant nothing. She was an enemy. She was a prisoner. She was just one more German among thousands, a minor figure in the vast machinery of defeat. Why had he cared whether she lived or died? "Why did he do it?" she asked, not expecting an answer. "He could have let me die. No one would have blamed him. The lieutenant wanted to keep moving. The orders were clear. Why did he stop?" No one had an answer. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and unavoidable. It was a question that challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy, about themselves, about the nature of war itself. If an American could show such mercy to a German prisoner, what did that say about the propaganda they had swallowed? What did it say about the regime they had served? What did it say about the world they thought they understood? The days turned into weeks, and the weeks brought more revelations. Work parties were sent to nearby American installations, where the prisoners glimpsed a world untouched by war. Clean streets swept free of rubble. Stores with goods displayed in windows, not hoarded behind counters. Children playing in parks without fear of air raids, their laughter carrying across the grass. The contrast with the ruined Germany they had left behind was almost too painful to comprehend. They had been told America was decadent, weak, a nation of mongrels without discipline or culture. But what they saw was strength, abundance, the confidence of a people who had never known invasion, never felt bombs falling on their homes. The guards sometimes talked to them, those who spoke a little German or were curious about the women who had served the enemy. Most conversations were superficial, safe topics that skirted the dangerous ground of war and ideology. The weather, the food, sports and movies and the homes they had left behind. But occasionally something deeper emerged. One young guard from Minnesota, a farm boy with sandy hair and an easy smile, showed Hilda a photograph of his family. His parents stood in front of a white farmhouse, flanked by two sisters in cotton dresses and a dog that seemed to be smiling at the camera. "My brother died in Italy," the guard said simply, his voice flat with old grief. "German sniper got him, January of last year. He was 22. Hilda did not know what to say. She had operated a radio in a command post. Had she ever transmitted orders that led to this boy's brother being in that sniper's sights? She could not know. The war was too vast, too complex for any individual to trace the threads of cause and effect, but the possibility haunted her. "I should hate you," the guard continued, looking at the photograph rather than at her. "When I found out I was going to be guarding German prisoners, I thought I would. I thought it would be easy. But you're just people, aren't you? Just people who got caught up in something bigger than all of us." He put the photograph away and walked back to his post, leaving Hilda with a weight in her chest that had nothing to do with her healing wound. The war had been full of certainties. Good and evil, friend and enemy, victory and defeat. The lines were clear, drawn in blood and rhetoric, but here in this strange American captivity, all the certainties were dissolving. The enemy was human. The enemy could be kind. The enemy could kneel on a dirty floor and save your life because it was the right thing to do, or share a photograph of his dead brother and admit that hatred was harder than he expected. If that was true, then what had all the killing been for? What had any of it been for? Hilda began to write in a small notebook she had purchased at the canteen, recording her thoughts in cramped German script that filled the pages faster than she expected. The writing was a compulsion, a need to make sense of experiences that defied her understanding. "I was taught that Americans were barbarous," she wrote one night, her pen scratching in the dim light of the barracks, "that they would rape and murder and destroy everything in their path. Instead, one of them cut me open on a truck floor to save my life. Another gave me chocolate and called me miss, as if I were a guest, not a prisoner. A third showed me a picture of his brother and said he should hate me but could not. How do I understand this? How do I make sense of a world where the enemy shows more kindness than my own government ever did?" The other women went through similar transformations, each in her own way, each at her own pace. Some clung to their old beliefs, insisting that the kindness was a trick, a facade that would eventually fall away to reveal the cruelty beneath. They hoarded bread crusts under their mattresses, waiting for the day when the food would stop. They watched the guards with suspicious eyes, looking for signs of the brutality they had been promised. But even they could not sustain their suspicion forever. The days passed, the weeks passed, and the expected cruelty never came. Else, the young woman from Hamburg, who had cried so much in the transport truck, began to laugh again. It started small, a smile at a joke, a chuckle at a guard's clumsy attempt at German. But it grew, and with it grew something that had seemed impossible in the dark days of surrender. Hope. Maybe the war was over in more ways than one. Maybe the hatred did not have to continue forever. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future beyond the ruins, a life beyond the propaganda, a world where enemies could become something else. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon 6 weeks into her captivity. Hilda was working in the camp laundry, folding American uniforms that smelled of soap and starch, the repetitive motion almost meditative. The work was easy, mindless, leaving her thoughts free to wander through the maze of confusion that her life had become. She was alone in her corner of the laundry room when Captain Morrison appeared in the doorway. She had not seen him since those early days in the infirmary, and for a moment she simply stared, the uniform in her hands forgotten. He looked older than she remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, the gray at his temples more pronounced. But his smile was the same, warm and slightly awkward, the smile of a man who was not quite sure of his welcome. He walked toward her, his gait slightly hesitant, and said in his halting German, "I wanted to see how you are healing. May I check the wound?" She nodded, unable to speak, and followed him to a quiet corner where a nurse waited with medical supplies. The examination was brief but thorough. Morrison's hands were gentle as he probed the scar tissue, checking for any sign of infection or complication. His touch was professional, impersonal, but she found herself holding her breath, intensely aware of his nearness. When he finished, he nodded with satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Very good. You heal fast. Strong." Then, unexpectedly, he sat down on a nearby crate and looked at her with an expression she could not read. "Can I ask you something?" he said, switching to slow, careful English that she could mostly follow. "Why did you join them? The military, I mean. Why did you serve?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that before. To the guards, she was a prisoner, a category, rather than a person. To the other women, she was a comrade, someone who shared their fate without need for explanation. But Captain Morrison was looking at her as if her answer mattered, as if she were a person whose story was worth hearing. She struggled to find the words, her English limited, her thoughts too complex for her vocabulary. "I was 19, she said slowly, the words coming with difficulty. "Everyone was joining. The boys went to fight, the girls went to serve. It was, how do you say, expected? Normal. I believed what they told us, that Germany was in danger, that we were surrounded by enemies, that our service was important." She paused, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I do not know what I believe now. Everything I thought was true was lies." Morrison was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant, as if seeing something far beyond the walls of the laundry room. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I have a daughter your age," he said. "Her name is Margaret. She is studying to be a teacher in Ohio. When I operated on you, when I was kneeling on that floor with your blood on my hands, I thought of her. I thought this could be someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. The uniform does not change that. The flag does not change that. You were a person who needed help, and I could help. That is all." He unfolded the paper, revealing a photograph of a smiling young woman with dark hair, not unlike Hilda's own. She was standing in front of a brick building, books clutched to her chest, her smile bright and untroubled. She looked like a girl who had never known war, never felt fear, never watched her world collapse around her. She looked like everything Hilda had lost. Tears welled in Hilda's eyes before she could stop them. She had not cried since the surgery, not through the pain of recovery, not through the confusion of captivity, not through the letters describing the ruin of her homeland. But now, looking at this photograph of a stranger's daughter, she felt something inside her crack open. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but necessary. "For saving me. You did not have to. You had no reason. And you did it anyway." Morrison folded the photograph and returned it to his pocket. "No," he agreed. "I did not have to. But some things are more important than have to. Some things are about who we choose to be, not who the war tells us we are. I have seen too much death in this war. Too many boys who will never go home. Too many families destroyed. Too many futures erased. When I could save a life, any life, I was not going to let it slip away because of uniforms and flags and all the other things that divide us." He stood, brushed off his uniform, and offered her his hand. She took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. This hand had cut her open and put her back together. This hand belonged to an enemy who had become, impossibly, something more complicated than enemy. A savior. A teacher. A reminder that humanity could survive even the worst of circumstances. "I hope you find your way home," he said. "I hope you find a good life when all this is over. I hope you remember that the world is bigger than this war, bigger than the hatred, bigger than everything they tried to make us believe about each other." Then he was gone, and Hilda was left standing in the laundry room with the smell of soap around her and the weight of a changed world pressing down on her shoulders. That night she wrote the longest entry yet in her notebook, the words pouring out of her like blood from a wound. "He saved me because he chose to. Not because of orders, not because of rules, not because anyone made him. He chose in that moment to see me as a human being when everyone else saw only an enemy. He looked at me and thought of his daughter. He looked at me and saw someone worth saving. If an American can do this, if an enemy can show such grace, then everything I was taught is wrong. Not just wrong, but the opposite of truth. The monsters we were warned about are more human than we ever dared to be. And if that is true, then I have to become a different person. I have to choose differently. I have to be worthy of being saved." The months in the camp passed slowly after that, each day both a comfort and a burden. The women gained weight, their cheeks filling out, their bodies recovering from the deprivations of war. Their hair grew lustrous again, their skin cleared of the sores and rashes that had plagued them during the final months. Physically, they were healthier than they had been in years, stronger, better fed, more rested. But their minds were in turmoil, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. They had served a regime that had committed unspeakable horrors. They had believed lies fed to them from birth, lies about German superiority, lies about enemy brutality, lies about a glorious destiny that required sacrifice and obedience. They had looked the other way while their neighbors disappeared, while trains rolled eastward carrying human cargo to destinations no one wanted to imagine. How did one live with such knowledge? How did one go forward when the past was too terrible to face? News of the concentration camps reached them through the guards, through newspapers left where prisoners could find them. The photographs were almost unbearable. Skeleton-thin bodies stacked like cordwood, mass graves filled with tangled limbs, gas chambers designed for industrial murder, their walls scratched by fingernails of the dying. Some women refused to believe it. The photographs must be faked, they insisted. American propaganda meant to justify the occupation. Others believed but could not accept their own complicity. They had not known, they said. They could not have known. They were just following orders, just doing their jobs, just trying to survive. But Margaret, who had been a nurse who had seen enough death to recognize its many faces, shook her head slowly. "We knew enough," she said one night, her voice heavy with grief. "We knew the Jews were taken. We saw the yellow stars. We watched them disappear, first from the shops, then from the schools, then from the streets. We told ourselves stories to avoid seeing the truth. We chose not to know." The silence that followed was heavier than any they had experienced. It was the silence of recognition, of a guilt that could never be fully lifted, only carried forward into whatever future remained. In the autumn of 1945, the repatriation process began. Women were loaded onto ships and trains, sent back to a Germany that was divided, occupied, and broken. The journey home was the reverse of the journey into captivity, but everything had changed. The women who left the American camp were not the same women who had entered it. They had been fed when their families starved. They had been healed when their country lay wounded. They had been treated with dignity when they expected only degradation. They carried these contradictions like stones in their pockets, weighing them down even as they moved forward. Hilda stood at the gate on the day of her departure, her notebook tucked into her small bag of belongings, the scar on her abdomen a permanent reminder of everything that had happened. She looked back at the barracks, the mess hall, the infirmary where she had spent those first precious days of recovery. It was strange to feel sadness at leaving a prison camp, but it was not the camp she would miss. It was the strange safety of it, the pause between the war that had ended and the uncertain future that awaited. In the camp, she had been forced to confront the truth. In Germany, she would have to live with it. Germany was a wasteland. The cities she had known were ruins, mountains of rubble where buildings had once stood. Munich, her hometown, was barely recognizable. The church spire she had seen from her apartment window was gone, collapsed in an air raid. The streets where she had walked to school were cratered and impassable. Refugees clogged every road, carrying bundles of possessions, searching for family, for shelter, for food. Everywhere was the evidence of total defeat. Hilda's mother was alive miraculously, living in a cellar beneath what had once been their apartment building. The reunion was tearful and raw. Her mother had aged decades in the years since Hilda had last seen her hair white, her face lined with grief and hunger. She wept at the sight of her daughter, touching her face as if to make sure she was real. "They told me you were dead," she whispered. "They said all the girls in the auxiliaries were killed or captured or worse. But here you are. Here you are." Hilda held her mother tightly, feeling bones beneath the skin, the weight that hunger had stolen. "An American doctor saved me," she said. "I was dying. My appendix burst, and he operated on me. In the back of a truck on a road in France. He saved my life." Her mother pulled back, confusion in her eyes. "An American? But they are the enemy. They bombed our cities. They killed your father's friends. How could they save you?" Hilda shook her head slowly. "I do not know, Mother, but they did. They were never what we were told. None of it was what we were told." Decades passed. Germany was rebuilt, divided by a wall, then reunited when the wall came down. The women who had been prisoners in American camps grew old, their memories of the war fading into the background of lives that continued despite everything. They married, had children, worked jobs, celebrated birthdays and holidays. They became grandmothers, great-grandmothers. They watched the world change in ways they could never have imagined. But some memories never faded, no matter how many years intervened. The taste of the first American meal. The feel of real soap on skin that had not been properly cleaned in months. The sound of a surgeon's voice saying, "She will live." These memories stayed sharp, resistant to the blurring of time, anchoring the women to a past they could neither escape nor fully understand. In 1983, Hilda Braun, now Hilda Kaufmann, sat in her comfortable apartment in Frankfurt and wrote a letter. Her hands shook slightly, the tremor of age as she formed the words. The letter was addressed to the Veterans Administration in Washington, D.C., and it asked a simple question. Was Captain Thomas Morrison still alive? She had tried to find him before, in the chaos of the post-war years. But the world had been too disordered, the records too scattered. Now, with time running out, with her own health failing, she had to try one more time. The response came 2 months later. Captain Thomas Morrison had died in 1971 at the age of 64, of a heart attack in his home in Columbus, Ohio. He had been surrounded by his family, including his daughter Margaret, now a retired schoolteacher. Enclosed with the letter was an address and a telephone number, along with a note that made Hilda's heart stop. My father spoke of you often. He called you his miracle patient. He said saving your life was the one thing from the war he never regretted. Hilda wept when she read those words. She wept for the man who had saved her, for the years they might have corresponded, for the conversations they might have had, for the things that would forever remain unsaid. But she also wept with gratitude because he had remembered her. In the chaos of a war that had killed millions, her life had mattered to someone on the other side. Her survival had meant something to him, had stayed with him through the decades, had been something he cherished rather than forgot. A week later, she called Margaret Morrison. The conversation lasted 3 hours, spanning the Atlantic, bridging decades and continents and the gulf between former enemies. By the end of it, both women were crying and laughing and making plans to meet in person. 2 daughters, 1 American, 1 German, connected by an act of mercy, performed on a dirty truck floor half a century before. They met in New York, neutral ground between their 2 worlds. Margaret was tall, with her father's warm eyes and a smile that seemed familiar even though they had never met. They walked through Central Park, sat in cafes, talked about their lives and their families and the war that had shaped everything. Margaret showed Hilda a photograph she had never seen, her father in his army uniform, young and serious, with the look of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. It was the face of the man who had saved her life, captured in a moment before the surgery, before the connection that would span decades. He always said the war showed him what mattered, Margaret said, her voice soft with memory. Not the killing or the winning or the politics. The moments when you could choose to be human. The moments when you could save instead of destroy. He said saving you was the moment that made everything else bearable, all the soldiers he could not save, all the death he witnessed. You survived, you lived, and that mattered to him more than anything. Hilda nodded, thinking of the truck, the pain, the hands that had refused to let her die. He gave me my life, she said. But he also gave me a different way of seeing the world. I spent 50 years trying to be worthy of what he did, trying to be the kind of person who deserved that mercy. I do not know if I succeeded. Margaret reached across the table and took her hand. You survived, she said simply. You raised a family. You lived. That is what he wanted. That is all any of us can do. They parted as friends, promising to write, to visit, to keep the connection alive. And they did. For the next 15 years, until Hilda's death in 1998, the letters crossed the Atlantic, carrying stories of grandchildren and gardens and the small daily victories of ordinary life. 2 families once divided by war, now joined by something stronger. When Hilda died, Margaret flew to Frankfurt for the funeral. She stood at the grave of the woman her father had saved, the miracle patient who had lived to grow old, and placed a single white rose on the coffin. Thank you, she whispered, for letting him save you, for making his life mean something. And so the story ends, not on the floor of a transport truck, but in the quiet apartments and suburban homes of women who lived ordinary lives after extraordinary experiences. The surgery that Captain Thomas Morrison performed in May 1945 lasted less than an hour. Its effects lasted a lifetime. For Hilda, the scar on her abdomen was a daily reminder of the enemy who had become a savior, of the moment when everything she believed was proven wrong, of the mercy that came from the most unexpected source. She told the story to her children, her grandchildren, anyone who would listen. Not because it glorified war, but because it proved something essential about humanity. Even in the worst circumstances, even when hatred is the expected norm, mercy is possible. Kindness is a choice that can be made on a dirty truck floor with a pocket knife and a prayer. The enemy is not always what propaganda claims. Sometimes the enemy is the one who saves your life. Sometimes the enemy is more human than we dare to imagine. Captain Thomas Morrison never considered himself a hero. To him, the surgery was simply what a doctor did, what any decent human being did when faced with someone in need. He did not see a German uniform on that truck floor. He saw a young woman dying, a daughter like his own, a life worth saving. In that moment, he made a choice that echoed across decades, touching lives he would never know, changing a story that might otherwise have ended in a shallow grave in occupied France. The women who survived American captivity carried complicated burdens for the rest of their lives. They carried the guilt of having served a murderous regime, the confusion of having been treated well by enemies, the weight of truths they had been forced to confront. But they also carried something lighter, something that made the burden bearable. The knowledge that humanity could survive even the darkest times. The understanding that compassion could exist even between sworn enemies. The faith that the choice to be merciful was always available, no matter what the world demanded. This is what the soap meant. This is what the bread meant. This is what the surgery on the floor of a transport truck meant. Not just survival, but revelation. Not just life, but the understanding that life could be different, that people could be different, that the future did not have to repeat the past. For Hilde Braun, the girl who should have died on a French road in the spring of 1945, every day after that surgery was a gift. A gift from an enemy who refused to be an enemy. A gift from a man who saw her humanity when she had forgotten it herself. A gift she spent 50 years trying to repay. As one of the surviving prisoners told her daughter many years later, "They taught us to hate. They taught us the Americans were monsters. But when I was bleeding out on the floor of that truck, a monster did not come. A man came. A healer. And he gave me back my life with hands that could have turned away but did not. That is the truth about war that no propaganda can erase. In the end, we are all just people. And some people, against all odds, against all expectations, choose to be kind. That choice is what separates us from the darkness. That choice is what makes us human. And that is a story worth remembering. A story worth telling. A story that proves, even after all these years, that hope is never lost as long as someone, somewhere, chooses mercy over hatred. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you true stories from World War I denne that reveal the human heart behind the history. These stories of mercy, courage, and unexpected kindness remind us that even in the darkest times, light can break through. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and stay tuned for more forgotten tales from the greatest conflict in human history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, remember, history is not just about battles and dates. It is about people and the choices that define them. The choice to hate, the choice to help, the choice to be human. What choice will you make today?